And a lot of Eagles fans haven't even had their first cup of Joe this morning. I don't mean to rile them up here, but
you're going to rile them up anyway.
They're all in. I'm not sure they're all in on Jalen Hurts, right?
No, they shouldn't be.
Okay, so to me, and I'm a big believer, I subscribe to the Bill Walsh philosophy that you draft a quarterback every year, you develop quarterbacks. You can never have enough because if you have good quarterbacks, you got equity. You could always flip and trade them. To me, Howie Roseman is a guy that takes a quarterback every year, whether you like it or not. Carson Wentz, Nate Sudfeld, Jalen Hurts. It might not always be in round one. Now, I think Howie Roseman could be eyeing to see what the Falcons or the Bengals do at 4 and 5. And if they say, hey, well, Justin Fields is our number 2 quarterback in the draft, and suddenly he's available at 4 or 5, I would not rule it out that he jumps up and takes a quarterback. I think it's very much in play.
Week 2 of Birds 365 underway with you. Mac guys, John McMullen, Jody McDonald. We got a insightful NFL draft guest to join us next, and we'll keep him for a bit. I've been talking to this guy for over a decade. He's been coming on all of my shows to talk NFL draft with me, and I'm glad. First chance I get to see his smiling face doing the show. He's been doing radio interviews with me for years. The creator of the NFL Draft Bible. Check it out at NFLDraftBible.com. Ric Serritella on Birds 365. How are you, Ricky?
I'm doing well, Mac Attack and McMullen. I love listening to the new show in the morning. It's been a great way to start my mornings, and so happy to be here, guys.
Appreciate you joining us. Rick, I know you've been doing this for years. Before we start breaking down players and figuring out what effect it's going to have on the Eagles, tell us about the game within the game. Leading up to the draft, the season of misinformation. It's always fun to try and read between the lines with what teams are playing. We know it's a quarterback-heavy draft at the top. There's already been one big trade, which included the Eagles. More verbal activity, more believable, less believable activity. Leading up to the draft, everybody's trying to position themselves as best they can to get the guy or guys that they want. How does this year compare to previous years?
Yeah, I think it's a big year for quarterbacks because we've counted already 12 new week 1 starters, and we haven't even hit the draft yet, and we could see like 5 guys go, never mind in the first round, maybe in the top 10, right? So to me, it's really the smoke screen season when you try to read the tea leaves really usually begins in the combine in Indianapolis. Everybody's in town. It's the who's who of the NFL football world. And, those late night conversations around the lobby bars can get quite interesting, and you learn a lot. And we didn't have that this year. And so even with the pro day circuit, which we didn't have last year, but we did have this year, it was still somewhat limited, especially for the media, to get access to the teams, to the players. COVID has just created so many loopholes. So I think from a media standpoint, it's been kind of hard to get reliable information. And when you do, it's been hard to confirm it with a second source. I think what you're seeing right now, there was legitimacy to the Jets' love affair with Zach Wilson. GM Joe Douglas wanted to, poke and prod and see these guys up close and in person at their pro days before he pulled the trigger on that deal. Now, on the Sam Darnold deal. Now, the 49ers, this one has got me, guys, because to me, I'm looking at it like, okay, I go back to Kyle Shanahan, the offense he was running with RG3 his rookie year in Washington. That was an unstoppable offense before RG3 was injured. Trey Lance is a guy that can do a lot of similar things. So to me, that would be the most logical choice. Hey, we still got Jimmy G. It's a reasonable contract at $25-26 million compared to some of the others. Hand the keys to the Cadillac over to Trey Lance. But then John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan, they're at Mac Jones' pro day over Justin Fields, and I'm hearing Mac Jones is the guy. And then you go and look at the Vegas odds and you say, hey, these guys are pretty good. They're usually not too far off the mark. And according to the odds makers in Vegas, Justin Fields is the favorite to be the 3rd quarterback off the board. So I am completely confused at what the 49ers are going to do with that number 3 pick.
Yeah, Rick, you bring up a good point. I think a lot of people go back to Kyle Shanahan and Matt Ryan and assume the Mac Jones. And I think there's some, obviously, they're very interested in Mac Jones, but he has been successful with other types of quarterbacks as well. So to me, obviously, that's where the draft starts. It's going to be so interesting, even more so Atlanta at number 4. Then what do they do? Do they get out? Are we going to have quarterback 1, 2, 3, 4? For the first time in the Super Bowl era? But before you get into all that, and get into all that because I want you to, but you mentioned the difference in this year with your preparation. I'm asking all the draft guys, how much different has it been? How much more difficult has it been to get real information? Because I got to tell you, Rick, I've never seen more 4.3s in my life. Everybody's a track star out there.
Yeah, and that's why we love the combine, right? It's the ultimate apples to apple, orange to orange comparison. Everybody's running on the same turf for a 30-year period. We have all this data that we can go back, and you have the laser times to kind of back it up. And when you go to these different school pro days, who's agent is putting out numbers, the school is putting out numbers, all these third-party sources that have alternate agendas, right? The agent wants to make their client look good. The school wants to sell the players so they get drafted and help on the recruiting. I think what we do here at the Draft Bible is just try to trade and share as much information as possible with other NFL teams. So it's kind of been a give and take approach because it's been completely different for me in terms of 2 years ago. I visited 25, 30 campuses. I went to another 25 games. I saw 75, 80 schools, football teams in person. I chatted with the coaches on the field before the game. I got to talk to some of the players. I'm in the tailgate hanging out with the parents, finding out who's in their entourage. And I didn't have any of that this year, right? It was just really relying on my resources and getting as much valuable information as I can from the schools. And I think what you've seen in NFL front offices, a lot of younger scouts, a lot of quote unquote information gatherers, not necessarily scouts. That's the New England Patriot model. Hey, you go in, you gather the information. Our decision makers will evaluate and decide who we want to draft. And so, it's been an upside down process because, just trying to get in. And even when we were allowed at schools, we're in the stands watching it, can't have any contact. So it's been very difficult to nail down those verified measurements. And we saw it a year ago. A lot of the FCS players didn't have a pro day, didn't have verified measurables, didn't have times. And so you saw a record low 6 players from the FCS get drafted a year ago.
Along those lines, with less information available, it's just a fact, Jack. Less games played, less availability to players, no combine. Last year, teams relied, at least in part, on the individual players and the information they gave them. I know there are a whole bunch of agents. They got pretty good videotapes to teams on what their players can do, doing drills and the like, knowing full well that the players put these tapes together. Their agents put these tapes together. So it's going to show you the good parts of a guy's game. Agents had a pretty big hand in it last year. This year, a little bit more on the information, but they opened that avenue that agents reaching out to teams got at least an ear of a top scout or a general manager and the like. How big a part of it this year's draft is that players are going to get the chance to sell themselves through their agent to teams before the draft takes place? It was kind of a door that was opened a little bit last year. Is it still open? Do you think teams are using information they're getting from the players directly?
I know they are, because going back to the process and having those veteran scouts, those are the teams that are going to really benefit this draft cycle. Because I'll be honest with you, I might not get a call back from Ohio State. I'm not in there every year and know, the head coach and all those guys. And so the same thing goes true with the NFL front office. You shut down the scouts' ability to come into the school. Well, now it's the veteran scouts that have those relationships that get the call back, right? Not everybody's getting the call back. These pro liaisons at the colleges, first of all, it's not their priority to make a player succeed at the next level. They're in the business of winning football games at the collegiate level, and I get that. I understand that. And so they're not going to call back 32 teams and have that same conversation. 32 teams, one team doesn't want to be on a call with another team. So that's not going to fly. And I think, it goes back to like, well, hey, what do we have on a guy? If we like him, well, hey, I didn't get the call back from the school. What do we have on file? Hey, the agent sent this film. Well, let's take a look. Let's see what the numbers are. And you kind of get a picture for who the player is. And to me, any information is better than no information. And I think that's just kind of the COVID scouting process that we're working with and dealing with.
Typically, Rick, you bring up that information aspect of it. If you think about NFL teams, how they usually do business, current draft choices are valued more than draft choices a year out, because there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know how good a team is going to be. We see worst to first every year in this league. What looks like a good pick this year might not be one next year. Has that been turned a little bit upside down because people are assuming you are going to have that more information is going to get back to normal next year? Because I look at what the Eagles did, moving back from number 6 to number 12 to get an extra first-round pick. They might have 3 first-round picks next year. Is that thinking more prevalent, that maybe we're better off getting a next year cycle where we're going to have more information?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Eagles weren't done wheeling and dealing. So I could see them moving up and positioning themselves in the top 5 with the ammunition that they have. But to answer your question, I think that especially day 3 this year, the draft picks for next year are going to be valued a lot higher. And it's just because of a supply and demand food chain where, Jody Mack can tell you, when you get the draft Bible, there's usually over 1,000 players on our big board for each draft class. This year, there's not even 600 guys eligible. So the draft pool has been cut in half. And you got these Super 6 seniors now that have returned to school. The transfer portal has opened the floodgates where thousands of players are entering college free agency in hopes of boosting their draft stock and getting seen by the NFL. So I think whereas an average draft pool, you have about 1,000 guys, 1,200 guys, we try to whittle it down to the top 500, 700 players. This year, there's not even 600 guys. And so, I think next year you might see a draft pool like the SRAs that the NFLPA certified agents sign players. I think there's 536 players that actually signed with an agent in this year's draft. I could see that number maybe triple next year.
Wow. That would be a lot of guys hitting the free agent / draft market. Ric Serritella here with us on Birds 365. All right, you mentioned the Eagles potentially moving up, potentially moving back. They've already moved once. They were at number 6. They dropped back to number 12. We know their general manager is a wheeler-dealer kind of guy. If they were to move back up, in your guesstimation, why? Is there a specific player, a specific position? What would be the Eagles' motivation to, after they garnered pieces for the future, to use those pieces to get back to a place that they've already been?
And a lot of Eagles fans haven't even had their first cup of Joe this morning. I don't mean to rile them up here, but
you're going to rile them up anyway.
I'm not sure they're all in on Jalen Hurts, right?
No, they shouldn't be.
Okay, so to me, and I'm a big believer, I subscribe to the Bill Walsh philosophy that you draft a quarterback every year, you develop quarterbacks. You can never have enough, because if you have good quarterbacks, you got equity. You could always flip and trade them. To me, Howie Roseman is a guy that takes a quarterback every year, whether you like it or not. Carson Wentz, Nate Sudfeld, Jalen Hurts. It might not always be in round 1. Now, I think Howie Roseman could be eyeing to see what the Falcons or the Bengals do at 4 and 5. And if they say, hey, well, Justin Fields is our number 2 quarterback in the draft, and suddenly he's available at 4 or 5, I would not rule it out that he jumps up and takes a quarterback. I think it's very much in play.
Wow. Yeah. You're going to get a couple spit takes in the coffee from Eagles fans. I do think it's interesting because before you came on, Rick, we had kind of had a discussion. There's been all these whispers that the Eagles are a team to watch if anything gets cleared up with Deshaun Watson, which is probably not going to happen in the short term. But longer term thinking, that means that they want an insurance policy. They're not completely sold on Jalen Hurts. You're right about, Howie Roseman used that term, quarterback factory, gets laughed at a lot for that. They draft, sometimes it doesn't work. Clayton Thorson didn't work. If you're looking at that day 2 or day 3 quarterbacks, the guys I keep hearing from NFL people at least are Davis Mills and Kellen Mond as guys who could be potential starters, guys who could develop outside of that top 5. Are those the 2 guys you're looking at as well?
Yeah, and I would not be surprised if Kellen Mond sneaks in the back end of the first round.
Wow.
With one of these teams that are looking, they didn't get one of those tier 1 guys, but you look around the league, all these aging quarterbacks. I would not be surprised if a team makes a move for a Kellen Mond because he has all the traits and characteristics that teams are looking for in a modern day quarterback, which is what? The ability to improvise, throw on the run. I think there was a lot of concern coming into this season about Kellen Mond's pocket presence, his awareness, his decision-making, and you saw him make great strides this year, have a couple of big-time wins. And so Kellen Mond's stock kind of escalated. Whereas Davis Mills, there was a lot of, I don't want to say expectations, but maybe hope that he could be one of these round 1 guys. I think he got a little bit of a raw deal with the Pac-12 because it was off again, on again, canceled games. A little bit hard to kind of hold that against him, but he flashes big-time arm talent. He's a very cerebral guy, obviously going to Stanford. He actually did an individual pro day workout during the week of the Senior Bowl. His agent, Joe Siegel, coordinated and planned that very strategically, which could help boost his draft stock if he got in front of enough NFL teams. So I do think it's Kellen Mond, Davis Mills, kind of in that tier 2. And there's probably going to be somebody that falls in love enough with Kyle Trask from Florida to take him somewhere on day 2.
I think Trask would be my favorite in that group, but I don't know that the Eagles going to be in position to take any of those guys if they go day 2. I'm looking more at day 3, and we'll get to that somewhere down the road. All right, Ricky, you said the Eagles could move up. Let's work from the premise they stay at 12. They don't move up. The pick is there at 12. It's their pick to make. I think cornerback is a big priority for them. Horn, Surtain. I need you to tell me if one or both will be available. If not, and they go elsewhere, my partner Johnny Mack believes in the Eagles sticking with history. It's in their DNA to get into the trenches, be it offensive line or defensive line. I'm not sure that anyone merits coming from either the offensive line or the defensive line. If Slater is there, okay. We believe Sewell will be gone. I don't know that the third offensive lineman merits being picked number 12. I don't know that any defensive lineman deserves to be number 12. Will one of the top 2 cornerbacks be on the board for the Eagles? If they're both gone, is there someone on either the offensive line or the defensive line that the Eagles can make an argument for at number 12?
Yeah, and I think that they will have an option to take the first corner off the board because I really believe that you're going to have at least 4 quarterbacks, maybe 5 in the top 10. And then the 3 blue chippers to me are Jamar Chase, Penei Sewell, and Kyle Pitts. They're all going to be off the board. There's 7-8 guys right there. So I think you are looking at a Patrick Surtain from Alabama, a J.C. Horn from South Carolina. And I prefer Horn slightly over Surtain just for his man-to-man coverage ability. I think it's a little bit higher. However, Christian Barmore, the defensive tackle, there's a lot of late buzz on him because if you look at the defensive positions, there's really no clear-cut consensus guy at any of them. Really, Micah Parsons at linebacker, maybe, but Barmore would be the other guy at defensive tackle that you could see a team like maybe the Eagles pull the trigger a little early than people are thinking about or estimating. And Rashawn Slater is a guy I think we've spoken about in the past, Jody, that, you know, to me, he's a right tackle. You start him there and you kick him inside if it doesn't work out. But to me, I have enough confidence in his talent, and his arms aren't prototypical, but they're long enough to survive and get by. But you are hearing, too, that some teams prefer a Rashawn Slater over a Penei Sewell, which is interesting to me.
Rick, you bring up that offensive line. Another guy that interests me because of his versatility, maybe has his arms are a little bit too short to play tackle at the pro level, is Vera Tucker. But he's got tremendous. I see a little, not necessarily as a player, but when Zach Martin was coming out, I'd always heard, he played left tackle at Notre Dame. He can play anywhere. It's a very safe pick. Do you see sort of some safety in a kid like that? And also Slater because of the versatility, because those two look like Eagles players to me.
Yeah, they look like plug and play starters that can last in this league for a good decade. It's just a matter of where do you feel comfortable with them. And to me, unless you are an elite guard, I have a hard time taking guards in the first round. The kid out of Notre Dame with the Colts, Quentin Nelson, would be an exception to the rule. Elijah Vera Tucker might be an exception to the rule because technically I view him as a tackle. Again, every team, like you look around the NFL, what team isn't looking to upgrade their tackle positions? Almost every team, right? It's just such a need. And to me, I've always looked around the league and saw the better guards are always tackles with deficiencies that kick in. So it's hard for me to draft a true guard in the first round. But to me, Elijah Vera Tucker, again, I think what you see with New England and Isaiah Wynn, very similar measurements. And I think Vera Tucker's a guy, you start him out at tackle. If not, you've got a great guard for the next decade.
Ricky, if the Eagles do get a top cornerback in those first two picks, and I think Dallas is going to take one before him, so I don't think they're going to get a top cornerback. I think they'll probably get whichever one Dallas doesn't pick. But if they go there with their first pick, wide receiver, second, third round, day two, we know the top three wide receivers. How good is the depth of this class? Is that going to be a position where you can find a guy in a day two, day three position who could actually come in and contribute to your team relatively early?
Yeah, the wide receiver class is the deepest of any position in this draft. But I do want to backtrack to that number 10 pick because I'm hearing that Dallas could have their eyes on Zaven Collins from Tulsa, Jamin Davis from Kentucky, two late risers. I know people aren't looking at linebacker as necessarily the main need there for Dallas, but they've been infatuated with Zaven Collins from Tulsa for quite some time. And Jamin Davis from Kentucky is another guy. I think people are going to be surprised how high those two guys go. In terms of wide receiver, we saw the impact these rookie receivers made a year ago. This year's class is even more talented, in my opinion. It's just unbelievable, the playmakers. And then you talk about the depth. To your point, Jody, it's like, hey, Terrence Marshall, Rashard Bateman from LSU and Minnesota, these are two boundary receivers that could very well be available at 43. And we saw Carson Wentz, the lack of playmakers. If Jalen Hurts is going to have any success, they've got to get him a playmaker on the first day or two. And so to me, a guy that could really do wonders is a Dwayne Eskridge in that Deshaun Jackson slot kind of deep threat. And you take a look at what he did this past season, Dwayne Eskridge, that is, and he's a slot guy that had some injury concerns, but all he does is make big plays. I love him. I think we have him 67th overall. And then Kadarius Toney, like he's a first-round talent most likely, but one of these guys you're hearing there might be some character concerns, maybe a little bit late to practice, couple suspensions that teams are digging into with Kadarius Toney. Does that cause him to slide? And to me, if you get a talent like that in the second round, that's like adding a Percy Harvin kind of element to your offense.
Rick, you piqued my interest with saying the wide receiver position is probably the deepest in the class. Couple that with a player like Barmore, interior defensive line. If you're looking for one of those guys, this is not the year to be at the top of the draft. So how much does that play into someone's thinking, the fact that, hey, you know what? Okay, Jamar Chase is number one. We're not going to get Jamar Chase, but there are so many good receivers. You can get somebody at 37 into the 40s versus interior D-line. You're not going to get that same type of prospect. Is that fair to say? And then the second part, besides wide receivers, what other positions do you consider deep in this class?
So, yes, I think that it goes back to the old draft war room philosophy. Hey, best available player or draft for need. And I think every front office is different. Every team is kind of case by case. Are you a rebuilding team? Are you looking to reload, or are you a contender that just needs a final piece to get over the hump? And I think you got to factor that in. When you're the Eagles, they've got so many needs. To me, take the best talent available. And I know Jody will get mad at me for saying this. It's Jalen Waddle all day long. Give me Jalen Waddle all day long. So the other part of your question, I forgot already. What was it, John?
It was the deepest positions outside of wide receiver.
And just to follow up on the wide receiver, like, to me, the Bengals pick is fascinating because the LSU offense 2 years ago was the most prolific offense arguably I've ever seen. And Jamar Chase had 15 touchdowns of 40 yards or more. Can you imagine bypassing that opportunity to reunite Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase? But it looks like it could happen because Penei Sewell, you got to protect your assets, right? Kyle Pitts, there's a lot of people that believe he might be the best player or best playmaker in the draft. And so if they do bypass on Jamar Chase, that is the Bengals, maybe the aforementioned Terrence Marshall, another LSU guy, is there for the Bengals in round 2. In terms of depth, I mean, I think that, offensive line, there's some pretty good ones. After Penei Sewell and Rashawn Slater and Elijah Vera Tucker, you've got guys like Spencer Brown out of Northern Iowa. Nobody's talking about this guy. He's a first-round lock. He's a plug-and-play guy that has huge upside, and he's a big, giant, 6'8", Jolly Green Giant. You talk about Creed Humphrey, the center. He's a guy that's going to go really high. Quentin Manners, the gut from Wisconsin Whitewater, D3. He's a guy. I think the offensive line is full of depth. And on the defensive side, I would probably say the linebacker position is now starting to grow on me with all the guys we mentioned. Micah Parsons, Zaven Collins from Tulsa, Jamin Davis from Kentucky, Nick Bolton from Missouri. These are all potential first-round picks at the linebacker position.
Yes, I have my own draft philosophical standpoint. That is, give me the best football player. Don't worry about the best athlete. Give me the best football player. And at wide receiver, that's Devonta Smith in this year's draft. But I digress. Different philosophical question for you. This is not a draft chock full, at least at the top, of guys who can make things happen on the edge. It's not a great pass rusher draft, be it outside tackled ends on a 4-3 set or outside linebackers on a 3-4 set. That's what I want to ask you about. Teams are going to come in with their own defensive schemes. They're going to judge a player playing in a collegiate defensive scheme. If they don't match up, how difficult is it to project a guy who played outside linebacker in a 3-4 to be able to come into the league and be put into the defensive end spot in a 4-3 and vice versa? A guy who played 4-3, now you run a 3-4 on the NFL level, that you can get him to shed a couple of pounds and be able to play linebacker. I just think that's so difficult to project. And if you're talking about a first-round pick or a second-round pick, you're expecting a lot from the guy right away. You're not going to have 2 years to get him up to speed. That's a pretty dicey pick for me. How difficult is it? You talk to guys, teams, coaches over all the years who try and make that transition, have a guy play one position, but then try and turn him into another. I don't think that works. I've never thought it works, and I've always thought it was a reach. You're talking about a round 6 guy? Yeah, sure. You got years to develop him. Go ahead. Not a top pick. How about for you? Is that a good philosophy to try and stay away from, or are you still subscribing to give me that best athlete?
There's a lot to peel back here on the onion. So you hear it, like in Carolina with Coach Rule, you hear positionless football, right? And that's how he won at Baylor. That's how he won at Temple. He recruited the athletes and he developed them. And so like a guy like Jason Owa from Penn State, who had 0 sacks this past year, but some people think he's the best defensive end pass rusher in this year's draft because of the size, the athleticism, the testing, the measurements. You can get hurt pretty badly. Just think about Mike Mamula, right? And you can get pretty hurt going off of measurables. I think it's become easier in the modern day NFL because of how many teams now run almost like a hybrid base. And so you see a lot of hybrid defenses around the league. And I think back in the day, these guys were called tweeners. Now they're called hybrid players. And it's like, hey, let's just try to find a way to get him after the quarterback. I go back to Von Miller when he came out. At the time, I said he's too small to play defensive end. He's a stand-up 34 outside rusher. And at the time, Denver was running a 43 base and played him at defensive end. They made it work. And I think it's just a matter of stop trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And if the coaching staff can adapt and utilize the player's skill set and put them in position to succeed, well, then that's where I think a player succeeds and fails. Now, I think from an evaluation standpoint, this is where the front office of the scouting department and the coaching department will collide. Because from an evaluation standpoint, scouts have these cutoff measurements. And, you know, I go back to a guy like Cam Gill from Wagner a year ago who set the FCS sack record, but he had 31-inch arms. And I couldn't find a single NFL scout to buy in on this kid. Not a single one. They said he's too short. He's pigeonholed. We can't play him at defensive end. He doesn't have the experience at outside linebacker, and he doesn't play special teams. So we got no use for him. Well, fast forward, 10 months later, he's in the Super Bowl there with Shaq Barrett partying in the backfield collecting sacks. Mm-hmm. And so like this year's draft, I think Gregory Rousseau is probably the most polished 4-3 hand in the dirt defensive end. Now, I spoke to Manny Lawson, I spoke to Coach down there at Miami, Coach Manny Diaz at Media Day a couple years ago. And he goes, Gregory Rousseau is a Manny Lawson clone who he coached at NC State. And so I'm saying to myself, okay, well, that's a pretty good player. But if I'm taking Manny Lawson at 10 or 11, I don't know how much value that is. So that's where you got to be careful. Team, need versus best available player. I think Azeez Ojulari from Georgia is very much in the mix, kind of in that Von Miller mold. Very similar size and skill set, athleticism. So those are kind of the guys I think we're looking at here in round one.
Rick, you've mentioned measurables a couple times. I think Rousseau is one of the most interesting kids in this draft because he looks the part. He had 15 and a half sacks before he opted out, but he spent his off time working with Chuck Smith, who was the great pass rusher in Atlanta. So he's doing some work where you could at least make an argument that maybe that prepares him better for the NFL than piling up sacks against bad ACC teams. I mean, I think that's the way you have to have it. But then he has a bad 3-cone drill, and it seems to take him off. You mentioned length of arm with tackles and Vera Tucker. That's an issue with him. That's an issue with Slater. Are these guys, when you see good football players, do you sometimes see scouts that are a slave to those measurements and maybe they have to look at other aspects, like Jody says, good football player?
Yeah. And, you see the shirt, the NFLPA collegiate ball that I work with. And I've been privileged enough to work with guys that have been in the NFL front offices, worked for NFL teams. And again, it's like, hey, there are obstacles when you love a player and you're pounding the table and you've got a guy who believes in measurements, and a lot of teams do. I think it's a more relevant thing than the media talks about because guys get eliminated based on measurements. The evaluation game is a process of elimination. That's why when you see, a glimpse of Jerry Jones' big board in the war room, there's only 80 guys in the entire draft that they're interested in. There's a certain guy that they're looking for. And so I think it is a big deal. And, the other thing with Rousseau, it gets talked a lot about Trey Lance and his inexperience. You take a look at Rousseau, he's only played about 15 games. And he had injury history before his first full season. So I think there's durability and experience concerns with Gregory Rousseau.
Ricky, great stuff. You gave us a half an hour plus. If you can, we'd love to have you back on week of the draft. We'll punch up again within the next 2 weeks. Thanks for coming on with us today. No, I've already got my on the computer copy of the NFL Draft Bible. If someone wants to get their hands on it prior to the draft so they can be ready to rock come the third Thursday in the month, how can they go about getting their hands on your NFL Draft Bible?
Thank you for that, Jody, because the herd is after me here with when are the books being mailed out? When are the books being mailed out? Okay, we picked them up on Saturday. We've got the envelopes all filled out. They're being dropped in the mailbox today. So by the end of the week, you'll have your hard copy version. But if you want one of those, go to allaccessfootball.com to get your copy, the PDF, the hard copy, and then, of course, NFLDraftBible.com for all your can't stop, won't stop draft coverage. Thank you, guys.
Ricky, great
Thanks,
stuff. Ric Serritella, NFL Draft Bible, here with us on Birds 365. And shoot, Rick is very amenable. He's a good dude. He and I have been friends for years. I'll get him back in 2 weeks. Right before the draft happens, I can guarantee you we'll punch him up for another spot. He's John McMullen. I'm Jody McDonald. We are Birds 365. We'll come back. Hour number 2 coming your way. Stay with us.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.